G. Mouritsen, welcome to Bendix Airways.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to flying with you.
Yeah, perfect. Can you please tell us who you are and what you do?
My name is Ole Mouritsen, and I'm a professor of gastrophysics and culinary food innovation at the University of Copenhagen in Denmark. So I'm a researcher. I have a background in physics, chemistry, biology, working across different disciplines for quite a number of years. I've turned my interest into food, and in particular the taste of food. So that's the short introduction. And to put it up right front, I'm very fascinated about Japanese cuisine and learning from foreign and ancient cuisines to help us eat a more plant-forward diet.
So, how did you end up working at the intersection of physics and food science?
That's a very long story, but being a physicist or physical chemist, those are the kind of disciplines within natural sciences that are very robust. You can take from one field to the other. So this transition has been taking on for quite a number of years, and it has a driving force has of course been that I'm interested in cooking. I like to cook myself. I like to interact with chefs. I like to dine, and during my time as focusing on sort of more hard natural sciences, I've gradually put in the laboratory more and more topics that are related to interesting gastronomical questions relating to food. So it's been taking place over maybe 25 years, and now I'm spending all my time on studying food. I'm now an emeritus. I'm an old man, but I'm still scientifically active. But I can now focus entirely on what I'm interested in. So I do research, I write books, I write papers, I give a lot of talks all over the world. And to put it short, now I basically only do what gives me pleasure.
That's nice.
That's a privilege, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. So, after studying this for so many years, what has surprised you most about how little we understand about something we do every day or several times every day?
Uh, maybe what has surprised me most is how poor language we have about communicating about food. And it's sort of interesting. It reflects on an old hierarchy with the senses. I mean, when we interact with the world, and in particular the part of the world we eat, which is food, since the antique, there's been a hierarchy of the senses. We have five basic senses, and ever since the ancient philosophers and way up into the 18th century, actually way up to today, we talk about sight as the most important sense, and then hearing, and then we have the lower senses, and lower senses are taste and its odor, and in between we have the sense of tactile sensation, the feeling, and that's the hierarchy we still have, and which means that whereas if we look at a picture or see a piece of art or see a movie, we can describe quite easily what we see with our eyes, even a long time after we've seen it. The same with music, sounds, something we can describe. We have a developed vocabulary describing these senses. But when it comes to taste, and you quite often find it with young people nowadays, when they expressed opinions about taste, they say it's bad or good taste, or give some expression about not the taste as the sensory sensation, but the judgment of the taste, because good and bad are not taste. I mean, we have five basic tastes: sweet, sour, bitter, umami, and salty. That's all what we got. And of course, the aroma, which is much more complicated. What struck me the most is that most people don't have a very elaborate vocabulary, not even the most simple one. And this is not to say that we should keep on talking about food all the time, but since, as you mentioned, all of us have to eat 3 times a day, and it's a substantial part of the culture, although we are to some extent losing food culture, which is, I mean, producing food, cooking food, serving food, enjoying food, taking time for all these processes, we have very poor language. So that struck me the most. Another thing is I noticed after joining departments that study what we call food science. That is, that you study food, what's inside the food, how it's transformed in the kitchen, how you package it, hygiene, nutrition, things like that. And I was surprised the first time I came to a food science department and I talked to people who were studying food, and I asked them, how does it taste? And surprisingly, they said, well, we haven't tasted it. We just study it. And this is maybe the other surprise, which took me as a physicist, a natural scientist. When we study the world, we do it in a supposedly objective manner, in the sense that we try to keep a distance between the object of study, and our own sort of perception and also judgment of what we study. But that is not the way it works with food, because food only makes sense if you actually use your senses to work on the food. That is, and all five senses. We use both the ears and the eyes and the palate with the taste. Probably we use the nose. We use our feeling, and all these things, by interacting with that sort of particular kind of subject, food as a piece of material, it only makes sense when you actually put it in the mouth or actually use your senses. So in that sense, bringing in yourself as when you study an object, your interaction with food is the only things that make sense when it comes to food. And that struck me even more with respect to some of the issues we have nowadays, where we know we have to change our dietary habits. Certainly in the Western world, we have to eat quite differently. We have to change the food systems. We have to eat much less red meat and much more plants. And most people have difficulty eating more plants. And if you ask why, and you ask people why, they say taste without being explicitly about taste, but it means that taste and the way you appreciate taste with foodstuff is, of course, very important for what you actually eat. So usually I say there's no food that can be considered healthy or nutritious or sustainable before it's eaten. I mean, as long as it's out there, it's waste. And that's sort of a very simple observation. And I think it is important for all of us to realize that the way we consider food and the way we have to change our food system, it has to go through the senses. We have to learn to listen, or maybe not word listen, but actually we have to listen, use all the senses to appreciate food, and also tell us how possibly to change eating habits.
I'm drinking some black tea now, and I had some green this morning, and I have to admit I obviously differentiate the taste, but I have to admit that I struggle to name it or to describe it in words.
So if I ask you what's the main difference between the two teas, I also like black tea and I also like green tea. May I ask you, is there anything that is really particular? You can not only that you can distinguish them, and obviously they look different.
I would say the green tea is milder.
All right.
Yeah. Is that the aroma?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and what about the black tea? If you have only the five basic tastes. Now I'm not talking about aroma. We talk sweet, bitter, sour, salty, and umami. Is there any of those basic tastes you think really?
I would at least say the green tea is sweeter than the black tea.
Right.
Yeah.
That's also my impression, and it can also be bitter, but usually it's sweeter, and it also has umami, this mysterious fifth taste, because there are certain amino acids in the green tea that gives it umami, which also tends to bitter any or dampen any bitterness it may have. Whereas your black tea and many people appreciate it for the bitterness. And even though in some food cultures, they use a very bitter tea and then they dampen the bitterness by adding milk.
Yeah.
It's quite common in England, whereas I like it, possibly you as well. I like the black tea and I appreciate it for its bitterness. And it's certain compounds that seeps out in the water. And we also know that the longer you steep the tea, the more bitter and also astringent. Astringent it may be on the tongue. Astringency is another word for what you may call not taste, because it's not a taste sensation. It's something that changes the saliva in your mouth such that it feels dry, and we use the word astringency. And it's because there's certain compounds called polyphenols in the tea that binds to amino acids in the saliva. And you can sort of imagine that makes the saliva a little bit more clumpy. And it's that it doesn't flow as nicely. It changes lubrication effects. And then we say it's dry or astringent. So that's
So
another example of things that are not taste proper. There are many others, for instance, the taste of pepper and chili and stuff like that.
yeah. So with regards to taste, how much is chemistry and how much is neuroscience?
Well, you can't really take the two apart, but to sort of take it from, and now we're talking basically physiology and neurology and not culture. Maybe we'll come back to that, but it's now known that the root when it comes to taste proper is that molecules in the food has to be dissolved in the saliva. It could be sugars. The saliva goes into something called taste buds, and the taste buds they have the number of cells that are actually nerve cells, and these nerve cells have antenna or receptors, as they call. They can bind, in this case, the sugar molecules, and there's an electrical signal that goes to the brain, in this case, to the taste center. And then so now you already in neurology, once you have things binding to the cells and receptors on the tongue, and then it goes to the brain. Now, the magic thing is, of course, now how do you interpret this? So there's an event, electrical event in the brain, and you have learned, in this case, if it's sugar, to say, well, this gives me the sensation of sweetness. So it's in the brain, and a lot of people discuss, where is the taste? Is it in the food or is it in the brain?
Yeah.
And it's kind of these deep philosophical questions that is very difficult to unravel, and maybe also uninteresting to unravel. But you can't decouple the chemistry that is happening in the tongue. In this case, as a molecule that binds to another molecule that shoots an electrical pulse to the brain, and the brain observes this, and then you couple it to memory, which is that you tasted this before, and then you say, well, it's sweet, and we have a consensus among those who our tasters, then we say it's sweet, and it's different from salt, and it's different from bitterness. So the brain is important, and what is extremely fascinating, I'm already touching upon it, the center for the taste, and the same thing with what we call the olfactory sensation, and that is the aroma, what we call smell. These centers are very close to the limbic center of the brain. That is the lizard brain. That is the most original part of the brain. That part which really takes care of survival. So it contains memories, emotions, things that are extremely important for us to react on and learn from. So, as I think everyone know, if you get a taste certain things or even have an aroma, you pass through a baker shop, and then certainly you're reminded about something in your grandmother's kitchen or a birthday party or a Christmas or whatnot. This is a very strong neurological coupling, which is extremely important for survival during evolutionary timescales, because we have these senses to help us in a dangerous world. So we developed over millions of years, sensors on our tongue, throughout our body, or eyes. I mean, there's sensors everywhere, nose, ears,
Yeah.
to help us handling being in a dangerous world. And that is particularly dangerous when you put it in your mouth, because most of the stuff out there is poisonous. I mean, you have to go millions of years back before we breeded plants or animals. You
Yeah.
should take care what you eat. So you better remember if there's something that has been bad for you. So if you got something that gave you nausea or pain in one way or the other, the brain remembers, and then you don't eat it again. And similarly, with things that has been connected with sort of a positive experience, it could, for instance, again be your grandmother's food, even if it need not be any advanced food, but what you had as a child, as you have at a birthday, something that is connected to pleasant memories, something that has been good for you. That is something we'll go back to.
Yeah.
So we stay away from something that is given bad impressions and go to something that has given good expressions. And I think most of us have been drinking some drinks we shouldn't drink and got nausea and even vomited. And you don't go back to that for a while.
Some do.
Yeah, well, some do, but that's right. Of course,
So, yeah,
many of these
like,
things we're talking about, which is evolution, culture, many cases overrule,
yeah,
because it's an evolutionary trait to look for something that has been good for us, and calories is good. And that's why and this is true for all of us in our genes, we seek something that is sweet. Sweet signal calories, sugars signal sweetness, and sugars are calories good for survival. And we also seek umami, this fifth basic taste, because it tells us if there's food that has a lot of nutrients, that's also good for us.
yeah.
And
How would you describe umami? Why is it so distinct compared to the other tastes?
I think the problem is that it's not necessarily that distinct, because it's interacting strongly with the other basic taste. And so quite often, well, we know, we come back to physiology, we know which compounds in the food that binds to the umami receptor.
Okay.
But the issue with this is that these compounds are often in foodstuff that also have other sensory cues that overrule it, in the sense that you don't pay attention to it. So let's take the tomato as an example. A ripe tomato, and you can compare it with a green tomato. And green tomato, you may say it's bitter and sour, and then you have a ripe tomato, and you may say it's sweet. And you may say, if you think of the outermost part of the tomato, some of the skin can be bitter. But actually, the most prominent of the five basic tastes of tomato, that's umami. But you only realize it after the other sensory impressions have sort of been washed out. And the best way of experiencing it is that if you bite in a ripe tomato and chew it for a number of times, and after you've swallowed the tomato and just sit around for a couple of minutes, maybe 5 minutes, then you'll find there's something that is filling the whole cavity of your mouth, something that lingers for a long time. That's umami.
Okay.
You'll also find in cheese. Many people wouldn't, I mean, like in hard, very mature fermented cheeses, they can be salty, they can be bitter, but the most strongest basic taste is actually umami, and it only comes after, you only realize it after a long time.
Okay.
So it's complex, it's the time duration, but there are many foodstuffs that has umami, and they're usually something that has proteins, or something that comes from meat, that is foodstuff that has muscular structure. And before I forget, maybe some who are listening up to now wonder about bitterness, because bitterness quite often signals something that you shouldn't eat. And that's also an evolutionary trait, isn't in our genes for all human beings, that we're supposed to stay away from bitterness. So the newborn child, whereas the newborn child really appreciates something that is sweet, something that is umami. And in fact, these compounds that give sweetness, umami, are very rich in mother's milk. But the newborn child do not want anything bitter. So probably both you and I, we like bitterness, but that's an acquired taste. It's something you learn. And we have different capacities for learning, depending on our the expression of the taste, the receptors on their taste buds. Some have more. Those people earlier were called super tasters, feel very intense. And but we can learn appreciate bitterness. For instance, I think most people had the first IPA bitter beer may not like it, or the first cup of coffee, or now we're talking about the black tea you have in front of you. I'm sure the first time you had it, first sip, you may not have appreciated, but you learn. But it takes time, it takes years. And in fact, it's good for us to learn, appreciate some bitterness, because some those compounds that give bitterness quite often are important for our health, because they're antioxidants, they have very protective properties. So it's good to learn. But I usually say this is culture. I mean, it's evolution that we like sweetness and bitterness, and that we like sweetness and umami, and we stay away from bitterness. But learning to appreciate bitterness, that's culture. And now we haven't talked about what's happening on the nose yet, but we may come back to that.
Yeah.
It even things a bit more.
Why is salt and sweet so attractive?
I mean, salt, because as I say, it's a signal, an ancient signal to us that that there are sugars in the food, and sugars are good for evolution. Salt, we have evolutionary. We know that it's important to get salt because it's electrolyte, it's ions that help make a proper balance in our membranes. Actually, the balance of
what is the taste of salt?
Well, we call it salty. And in fact, that is very clean in salt taste. So whereas before we talked about, say, cheese, it also has salt, but at the same time it's bitter, and at the same time it's umami. But salt is very clean in this one basic taste, and that's also why we only have one word. I mean, salt, kitchen salt, sodium chloride, we call it salty. But there are also other compounds that are salty, and some of those you may want to use to provide some saltiness without getting elevated blood pressure, which is an issue for many people nowadays with hypertension.
Yeah.
So I can't tell you why we decided on some stage to call it salt. And it's even more complex for chemists, because what we call salt is a whole group of different compounds. And in fact, the compounds that elicit umami, called glutamate, is also a salt, technically speaking, a salt with an amino acid called glutamic acids, which is one of the most important amino acids in our food, in proteins, very important nutrient.
Yeah. So you spoke about flavor and taste being closely related. What about texture of the food?
When you say flavor, I just have to add one thing, because now flavor is an English word, and in my language, and probably the same in Norwegian, we don't have a word for flavor. We just use the word taste.
Yeah.
And flavor is actually, in the English language, is a combination of both taste on the tongue and the smell in the nose. And to some extent, people also include texture, that is how it feels. Other languages have different words. For instance, Spanish, they have taste, they call it gusto, and taste, flavor for sapo, I think. So it depends on the language. So in my language, we're very poor, even just describing or distinguishing. Yeah. So when we in Denmark and say in Norway say taste, you basically mean all the sensory information you get. So as an example, if you take the taste of an apple, well, what do you say? Taste of an apple, there are many things that comes in. One is that when you bring the apple close to your body, it has a certain aroma smell. So you say now the apple smells sweet, but of course that's nonsense. It can't smell sweet, but that's because the aroma compounds in the apple reminds you that on times where you're actually eating the apple, it turns out to be sweet.
Mm.
Same thing when you touch the apple and you feel it's hard, then you probably say, well, this apple, it looks juicy or it looks hard. And then when you bite in it, then a lot of things are happening. The juices of the apple comes into your saliva and now down in the taste buds, and the taste buds report that may be sweet. It could also be bitter. It could also be have some other sensation. And as you chew along and feel on the apple, the most important thing of the so-called taste of the apple is now happening, because that's while you chew and you exhale through the nose, you get the aroma compounds from the backside, and that's the most potent. And you know how potent it is because when you have a cold, we say that food tastes differently, but it doesn't. It has the same taste, but it has different. You can't detect the aroma because the saliva, the mucus layers in the nose is cluttered, and so all these sensations are part of the taste experience. And then when you come to texture and you bite in the apple, and now you say, well, this apple tastes, it's crunchy, or it could be mealy, it could be dry. All these expressions that are not taste proper, it's a way that you so-called tactile receptors, those that can sense push and pulls and vibrations between the teeth and against the palate, they have sensed that there's something with the physical structure of this apple that leads to a sensation. And this is what we call mouthfeel, or technically we call texture. And texture is that part of the physical structure, in this case of the apple, that you can detect in the mouth. And these sensory cues are extremely important. Because an example, if you take an apple and it smells like summer and it feels like a hard apple, and then you bite it, and then it turns out to be mealy and dry, then the so-called taste experience is completely different, even if it has the same taste, but it's because the feeling in the mouth is very different. And that's texture is an example, or mouthfeel is also a word where many of us don't have much of vocabulary. And it's actually quite interesting if you go to a restaurant, ask chefs, restaurateurs in a restaurant, when people complain about food, quite often people would not complain about the food because they say it doesn't taste good, or it tastes bad, or they may say too much salt. But if there are any complaints, it's usually about texture, and that is the steak is chewy instead of tender, which are not taste, it's mouthfeels, or the coffee has gone cold and supposed to be warm, and so on. And this is actually, the mouthfeel is most often something you observe when it's wrong. That is, then you can see, well, there's something wrong here. And the worst thing you can think of, now let's do a little experiment. You think about, I give you 2 potato chips, and one is just taken out of the bag, and you will appreciate it and say it's nice and crunchy and it tastes good in some way. And then I give you one that has been out of the bag for a couple of days, open, and you chew on it, and they say, wow, what did you do to this chip? Because it tastes very different. Did you use some other oil or less salt? No, it's the same chip, but it's no longer crunchy. And crunchy is actually an interesting example. That's a texture property, a mouthfeel property, but at the same time, it also couples to the ear. So when we say crunchy, it's a feeling in the mouth, but also an auditory sign in the ear. So in this sense, you taste using your ears. And if it's not crunchy and it doesn't appeal to the ears, you won't eat it because you expect it to be like that and not soggy or like cardboard. So texture is important. And so technically, texture is that part of the physical structure of food that human being can observe. So here I have an example that this particular kind of property of food only makes sense if there's a human being or some other being that actually interact with the food.
Exactly. Yeah. So you spoke briefly about the chef. What kind of physical principles does a chef rely on?
Oh, a lot, and in many cases without knowing. I mean,
Yeah.
and do not necessarily know. But of course, the most common things that happen in the kitchen is that you make mechanical changes to the food. You cut and peel and do all sorts of things. You use heat. You have the stove is a very important part of the equipment of a traditional chef. So there's something about temperature. There's something about heat. There may also be something about pressure. And the way these mechanical properties and also thermodynamic when it comes to heat is changing the properties of food is of course very important for the kind of food the chef want to produce. And then there's a lot of chemistry which most chefs don't know much about, but in main case they do know about acidity, how acidity affects color, texture, taste of food. And also many chefs would know what's happening at high temperatures, where this miracle of browning takes place, whether you bake a bread or you have a steak with or a roast with a crust, that there are chemical reactions that are happening between certain substances in the food. And some chefs know that if the browning is not complete enough, you may have to add something, for instance, on bread. If you wanted more brown, you would add some egg, whisked egg, and then the browning takes place. So many chefs know this, although they don't know what's happening underneath. Although I think it could be helpful for them to actually know it. So quite often with chefs, they have what we call tacit knowledge, something that they've just learned and know how it works. And I think one of the most interesting things for a scientist, myself, is to interact with chefs and try to figure out how does this work? I mean, what does the chef actually know? And can you sort of take this knowledge out? And which is of course very important for when you train new chefs, have apprentices, that and this is my own conviction that the future chef would have to be taught quite differently from previous chefs, which usually learn by inspection or the instructions. So the older chef will say, you do this and this and that. And the apprentice better not ask why, because, well, the chef will say, well, that's the way we do it. and but chefs nowadays, and certainly chefs in the future, they would need to know somewhat more, because many chefs in the future, they will go out and make new businesses. They'll do innovation. They have to work with other people in order to provide the proper nutrition, also the proper taste, for instance, in catering, in hospitals, in elderly homes, where it's becoming more and more clear that you need much more than knowledge about nutrition in order to get the elderly people to eat. You actually need to know about taste. So one of the things I've been involved with in the recent almost 10 years is working with chefs and chef schools. And we also produce new teaching materials for the coming chefs where they get some more knowledge in order to make it easier or make it easier for them to make sort of innovation. And based on previous knowledge, you can add new knowledge, and in particular, also making it allowed to ask these questions. That is, why is this happening, and why doesn't it work?
Yeah.
And learning from experience. So I see there's a demand in hospitality colleges and also among ordinary chefs that they want some more information. And this is where where we sort of are bridging from the sciences which we now call gastrophysics or molecular gastronomy, those sciences that has focused on the gastronomical value of food, not hygiene and nutrition, but the gastronomical value of food, for instance, in terms of taste and taste perception, and how this can be used in the toolbox of the future chef. So I think also one should be aware of the fact that we are in a major crisis at the moment. We have to change our global food systems that are not sustainable at all. And the global food systems are responsible for 30%, at least 30% of the stressors on the climate and the use of resources on the planet. This has to change. We are in for a major change in our food systems. And here the chef will play an absolutely important role because they're the persons who know about food and know about how to prepare food in a way such that people will eat it, and also learn how to cut waste. Because one thing is that people should change dietary habits. We have to stop throwing away 30% of our food. Here chefs will be extremely important. So I'm not talking about chefs that are going to make béarnaise sauce for 30 years. No, chefs that actually do something more fundamental in helping people to change dietary habits.
What about an everyday chef like me? What kind of basic principles could elevate my food?
Well, of course, I don't know what you know, but I don't want to tell chefs what they should do, but what I'm listening to what chefs are asking for. So, and I think the chefs themselves know much better where they fail and where they may ask for help. And I would say certainly science is not the only thing that chefs need. I think also chefs would need to know more about food culture. I mean, the way human dine. I mean, together, hospitality, and course, I know many chefs are very much engaged in that. So I don't think I can teach you something, but maybe you can learn something from what I'm saying and what I'm writing, hopefully. And because the chefs are, I have great respect for chefs because what they can do is that they can combine the skills of their hands with the knowledge they got in their heads. I mean, they're the ones that really, just like other skilled craftsmen, they combine their hands with their heads. And I would claim that some of the young chefs who are coming out, we may want to put a bit more into their heads while they're still learning things by instruction from their master chefs, because that's not going to go away. That I would even say it has to be strengthened. But also the older chefs have to be prepared to be challenged by the young people who say, well, you say I'm supposed to do it like this, but why? I would say the older chefs should they should be open to those questions, and then at least help the young person on he or her way to figure out why this is an interesting question, because curiosity, and that's very much true in the field of cooking, curiosity is a driver for innovation, and so I don't know what I can teach you, but I think maybe if we start talking about things you yourself have observed while you cook, and say, well, why doesn't this work, or could we do it differently? Maybe the knowledge from the sciences could help. And I have a very interesting example. I don't know, do you know Harold McGee? Harold McGee is probably the most respected food writer in the world. He wrote a book called On Food and Cooking. And it's a huge, thick book that has been in print now for, I think, 30 years. And many chefs know this book and constantly go back to this book. And McGee, he's a food writer, but he has also knowledge about food culture, cooking, science. Look up his book on food and cooking, and And whatever, I always turn to that if I want to know something. And of course, it's an old book, but it's still there. And what I noticed that chefs, they can read it. I mean, because it's written in a way, so it's not complex, and you constantly learn, and it's a mine of information. So I think that kind of input, at least to some chefs I've been interacting with, they really appreciate that.
Yeah.
And use that as sort of a go-to source. And this is very different from a cookbook, because a cookbook, also the elementary books that are used in hospitality schools and chef colleges, it's very much sort of instructions, do this and this and that, and here are illustrative examples of recipes, and you add this and this and that, and you have to measure and this. I mean, it's very sort of pragmatic without very much sort of explanations why.
See.
And I think this is, if the future will ask for more knowledge-based cooking.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that you can't make a béarnaise sauce without knowing anything about emulsion and emulsion behavior, but I think it will help you if you want to do new things.
Yeah. So to ask you then a bit more about texture and why it matters so much, what's happening at the structural level when food feels creamy, crispy, chewy, for example? So if I'm cooking a steak, why am I told to cook it on really high heat for like 90 seconds or 2 minutes before lower heat? And what does it do?
Yeah, the high heat is usually meant to form these we call it Maillard reaction. If I say Maillard compounds, does not make sense, but that is what gives a brown color.
Okay.
And gives this particular aroma and taste of browning. The same on the crust of the bread. So the fast heating provides for this, and then you can cook it at a lower temperature. Browning takes place around 150 degrees. There may also be some caramelization that takes place at higher temperatures for some meats, depending on whether you baste it with something. There can be some caramel forms. This is what people love with food. And then you may cook it at a lower temperature in order to cook it to whatever degree throughout the meat. And here's an interesting finding. Quite often it's said that you have to do it at a high temperature to close the pores of the meat. It has proven not to be the case, but it's kind of a what is said. So the later cooking is to at lower temperature turn the collagen, I mean the collagen tissues, into gelatin, which help for the juiciness, and also to some extent denature the protein so that it's become more tender. And then the rest of it is almost, and this is where it becomes an art, because when you cook a steak, it's something that we say it's not an equilibrium, in the sense that you cook for a certain period of time and then the heat has transported in the cooking, but it's not uniform. Similar thing when you cook an egg. I mean, if you just cook an old-fashioned way and not using a thermostat, it's a matter of how long time. So you mix up in your head concepts of temperature and heat and time. So chefs who can really cook a perfect piece of meat, they can basically, and probably you can correct me here if I'm wrong, but they can, by touching the meat, pushing on the meat, feel where that particular kind of meat is done to the degree that he or the customer wants it.
Yeah.
And this situation with collagen turning into gelatin and proteins being denatured, these are two processes that have different temperature dependencies, scientifically which means that it's complicated. And this is where then the craft, the knowledge, the experience of the chef can do it to perfection without knowing the details, because even physicists would have difficulty doing the full calculation and actually figuring out, although some have attempted. There's I don't know if is that how much is used by chefs, but some years ago there was an American who made a set of cookbooks he called modernist cuisine, Murwald was his name, where they studied, for instance, for meat, what's happening at different temperature conditions, looking through the meat, measuring all sorts of things. It's complicated. So here experience can sometimes beat whatever good science you can do. But the answer to the question is you want the crust, and you know very well this is not going to work if you use a sous vide, because the sous vide only operates up to 100 degrees, the boiling point of water, so you don't get a crust. So if you make sous vide of meat, you would have to put it at high temperatures afterwards in order to get the crust. So sous vide is an example where you actually deal with, in this case, meat. It could be also other things. It could also be an egg, the way you cook an egg in a thermostat. You cook it at one precise temperature, and this temperature is completely the same throughout, and you get the tenderness you want, and then you take it out, and you have to roast it before you get, for instance, a steak, which you need the crust. Same thing with bread. Bread that has been cooked rather than baked doesn't have the crust. And the crust gives the taste and aroma, but also the texture. I mean, it can be crispy and interesting to bite in. That is, you bite into something that is crispy outside, then juicy and tender on the inside. I think this is what many people appreciate with meat. And this is also what those who said, I want my meat. I claim you can make foodstuff of plants that are just as tasty as meat, but it's very difficult to get the texture of meat.
Just to finish the steak, why is it advised to pour butter on the steak throughout, or when you're done with the first roasting, so to say?
I have no idea. I would never do that myself.
Okay.
But
Okay.
obviously, butter is fat. So fat, when it comes in contact with a hot pan, it brings temperature up. So it's a good conductor of heat from the pan to the steak. But I don't know. You talk about putting on the top, or
Yeah, just pouring with a tablespoon
okay,
several minutes after it's been roasted.
I could certainly imagine that it will probably improve the juiciness, because less fat is then going out of the beef itself, but also it provides for a good coupling to the temperature of the bottom of the pan. And some likes the taste of melted butter. I just happen not to like that. I like cold butter. So,
Okay. And there's something I learned a couple of months ago. If you have a deep fry or deep frozen bread, for example, yeah, you take it out and you put it under cold water for 15, 20 seconds, deep frozen, then you put it in the oven at about 220 degrees and cook it for like 20 to 25 minutes. And it's just like new. What's happening there? Instead of having the gradual defrozen.
I don't think I know the answer to that offhand. And it has to be cold water, you say?
Yeah, because the texture becomes very different than when you slowly heat it.
All right.
Crispy.
Right. This Maillard reaction I mentioned to you, what's happening on the crust, which is a combination of carbohydrates, sugars, and proteins in the crust, that depends on water. So I think maybe what you're doing, you're slowing this Maillard reaction such that it takes time over a longer period. But that's the best guess I have. But because food is so complicated, there could be other. If this is certainly an effect, but whether it's the most important one or not, this is an interesting experiment one could do between a chef and a scientist, and actually try to figure out what is happening here. And so immediately when I say cold, does it need to be cold? Could you also do it with warm water? Now you say cold, maybe just because it's cold out of the tap. An interesting question, but it surely, I would expect, has to do with the chemistry in the formation of these brown compounds that provides for the crust.
Let's see.
That's my best guess.
Yeah. Is our modern food environment mismatched with the biology we evolved with?
I think very much so, depending on which part of the world you're talking about. I mean, obviously, as I said, because of the fact that food industry is using, if we talk about sort of, most people nowadays get the food by food industry, and this is true in a very large degree in many parts of the world. The food industry is using all sorts of agents to couple to your brain such that you eat more of it, even if you shouldn't. So in many cases, aroma compounds, also some taste compounds, additives, screw up our sort of native knowledge about how to steering in this complex world. So I'm not an expert in these matters, but as we certainly can see for sure, that is, obesity is the most rapidly increasing, basically epidemically increasing dietary disease, and all those follow diseases that comes after that, with cancer and diabetes and whatnot.
Yeah.
So that part of the modern food landscape is certainly mismatched, and maybe to some extent it also, you can say, it's perfectly matched in the sense that it drags us to eat something which we really shouldn't eat. So this, of course, what the food industry is using this. I'm more, and of course, an aspect of that is also that a lot of this food, the ultra processed food, we know now for sure is not good for our gut. It's very bad for the human microbiome, and which gives us all sorts of physical diseases, but also mental diseases. The more we know about what the gut bacteria do and how they signal to the brain, the more it's clear that what we eat is not only for our own body, it's also for the livelihood of all the bacteria in the colon. So I'm not expert in any of these matters, but it's quite clear it's not matched. But I also alluded to that before. What I've been interested in, that in the new foodscape, where we know, and this is the recommendations, that we should eat much more plant-based. The plants, even if they're nutritional and very good for us, of course, there's some nutrients you can't get from plants. Even they're very good for us. Think, for instance, proteins. You can replace meat proteins by plant proteins. Plants are not, they're not matched for those tastings that are innate in us. That is, those I claimed is in our genes, that sweetness and umami. And this is what I think is maybe a mismatch one should really look into very carefully, because there's a reason why people have difficulty eating 500 to 600 grams of green every day. And that's because the taste of these plants, I'm not talking about fermented plants or plants that are prepared in a particular way, but just the plants as they are, except for the ripe fruits, they're not matched to humans' innate desires for certain basic taste. In addition, they also have, even if you breed it away, some of it, the bitterness, as we talked about before. So if you ask, what do I get from a plant? Think roots, stem, foliage, the green leaves, the flowers, the unripe fruits. Generally, they don't have any sweetness, very little, because the sugars are bound in what we call carbohydrates, like starches. Carbohydrates have no taste. And all the amino acids, which we talked about before, glutamate, glutamic acid, which can give umami, the amino acids are bound in proteins. So even if dietitians say you should eat more legumes, more peas, beans, and lenses, because they have 30% protein, well, protein have no taste. because the amino acids, as long as they're locked up in proteins, just like sugars when they're locked up in carbohydrates, they have no taste. They cannot reach our taste buds. So quite often I say this green stuff is not supposed to be eaten, and from that point of view, and of course that's true from the point of view of the plant, because plants don't have any interest in being eaten. It's only the fruits, because the ripe fruits, because that's the way to dispersing their genes and reproduction. So that's basically the issue you have. If you told you should eat more plants, and then I say, what do I get? Well, you don't get sweetness, you don't get umami, and then you get bitterness. And I ask, what's in my genes? I'm not talking about what I culturally had been brought up to, but in my genes, it say, look out for sweetness, look out for umami, and stay away from bitterness. That's the clash. So I think that's the most monumental mismatch in a future foodscape. And that exposes the difficulties and also tells us what challenges we have when we have to change our dietary habits. And this is dramatic. I mean, nowadays, in the western part of the world, it's certainly true of Scandinavia, from where we're speaking. I think about 60% of the calories in our food comes from plants, whatever plant-based. The target is 84%. This is a calculation from the so-called Eat Lancet Commission, a commission that has tried to figure out what do an average person on the planet need to eat such that you have healthy, nutritious, and sustainable food for these 9.5 billion people. You have to eat much more plant, much less meat. And the target is 84% of the calories to come from plants, and you start with 60. It's a very long way. And we have some data in Denmark for the best possible case, how much you can sort of nudge the shift to more plant-based. It's less than 1% point per year. And it's getting very difficult in the end because plant foods are much less energy dense than meat. So to me, that's the largest mismatch. And this is where we need the help of chefs. And based on the knowledge that we have, well, where can we sort of, if you permit me to say, how can we remedy? And I know vegetarians and vegans, they hate me when I say that. When I say, how can you remedy the lack of these important tastes in plants? Well, you have to do something to the plants. And the tradition in other countries, Asian countries, for instance, and it's also coming in the western part of the world, that is to ferment the plants. So fermentation break down big molecules like proteins and sugars into small molecules, and then you get taste. And everyone knows the big taste difference between a green, say, soybean, edamame, and soy sauce or miso. That's because you have released the free amino acid. The same thing you can do with sugar. So that's one way. The other way is to add something when you eat green food. And now we're back in the kitchen because chefs know how to do this, and everyone who cooks is an old knowledge. You have to add something, and this is what we call sauces, dressings, marinades, condiments, small amounts that can help elevate the taste or add umami. And in the northern part of Europe, in fact, worldwide actually, where a common staple in food is potato. Potato needs some help to be eaten. So what do? You use a gravy or brown some kind of sauces. And if it's other parts of the world where the basic staple is rice, lots of good nutrients, but not very flavorful, not very tasty, you add something that has umami. It could be a little bit of soy sauce, it could be a little bit of miso, and it could be other sort of fermented products in small amounts. And I think that's the key lesson. That is, sometimes you only need very little to help you eat a lot of plant-based foods. So this is the knowledge that stems from basic science. And if you combine that with cooking and craft and skills from the chef, you can help people eat plant-based food without compromising taste. And I think the last thing is very important because, as you know, if people don't like the food, appreciate the food, they may eat it for a couple of days and then they'll go back to what they usually eat.
Yeah.
So you have to pay attention to the taste buds. So be back to the beginning. How do you learn about the food that is tasting, and then you couple it to your culture and experience and memories. So I think this is one of the most seen from, as a scientist. I think the most important thing is role of a chef in the future. That is to help all of us who have difficulty eating 500 to 600 grams of green every day. And the most striking example is possibly legumes, peas, lenses, and beans, loaded with proteins, but not very tasty. And I know vegetarians also hate it when I say it, but it's a matter of fact, they don't have any umami. They may have interesting aromas. Sometimes the textures is problematic because, you know, cooking, for instance, kidney beans or chickpeas, it can be quite mealy. And you may be able to eat a hummus from chickpeas if you add some spices and some oil or some I would usually add dashi, I mean, an extract that has a lot of umami. Otherwise, it's uphill eating these things. And this is where the umami-rich condiments, sauces, seasonings help. And this is ancient knowledge from the old peasant cuisine in our part of the world, and the Asian cuisine is still sort of blessed with this knowledge. They know how to do it. And everyone in the Asian cuisine knows that a drop of fish sauce, a drop of soy sauce can save a whole Mediterranean dish. Maybe not fish sauce, but there's so little that is needed.
Speaking of green and plants, you've written about seaweed and marine food sources. Do you see seaweed as a global food source in the future?
I definitely do, and I think we have to look into that source. And seaweeds, they're not plants, but we think of them as plants. They're algae, and just to see the monumental impact they can have on our food system, if you see how much what I call organic production on the planet that is forming essentially macronutrients like proteins and fats and carbohydrates, it's formed by the algae. Maybe 60, 70%. And since algae are performing photosynthesis, they're also responsible for a lot of the oxygen in the air. So they're the largest motor on the planet to produce organic material. And organic material can be food. And if we only for that thing only consider that thing, you say, well, you have to look out for these organic resources. And then people ask, well, how do we eat it? And can we eat it? And again, here, it's known in other places of the world that, for instance, seaweeds and also some of the microalgae, small algae, they're part of the diet. It's a large part in Asia. It's no big deal. They use it in soups and salads and stuff, maybe up to 5% of the nutritional value. And it's interesting with seaweeds because there are no seaweeds that are poisonous. So a few in the tropics, but basically they're all harmless to humans, and we just have to learn to cook with them. And this is what I spent some time on over the years. I'm also writing books and papers and done a lot of workshops with chefs, teaching them how to use seaweeds. And it's very easy, and I'm happy to tell you how, but it has to come in the green transition. And both because it's an important motor of organic material on the planet, but also because it's the most sustainable crop you got. Because algae, and let's take seaweeds, how do they live? They live off sunlight and then nutrients in the water. They don't have to be fertilized. They don't have to be watered. You don't have to use pesticides. So the microalgae is a little different. You can also grow microalgae. Some of them are poisonous, but a lot of them are actually edible. And some vegans know that you can eat spirulina and chlorella as a nutritional supplement. So in order for this to work on scale, people are now even talking about a seaweed revolution. You have to, it has to be farmed. We have to make aquaculture in the water, and we have to figure out how to do that in a sustainable, environmentally responsible way. I think 95% of the seaweeds on the planet is farmed in the East, and there's very little in the western part of the world. A number of experiments around the world, also in Norway and North America, and also in this part of the world. But we have to face that when it comes to the ocean, we're really still hunters and gatherers. I mean, it's like people were on the land 6,000 years ago. We're still mostly picking wild species, and we don't know enough about how we protect the environment. So a lot of issues can happen. We know that from fish farming in certain countries, that you screw up the ecology. So this has to be done in a much more insightful manner. But there's no way but seaweeds and algae, they have to come in as part of the green transition. And finally, there's a nutritional factor here, because even if, I mean, we can eat more plants, and we can enrich them by various kinds of seasoning and condiments. Plants, by nature, they lack certain fundamental essential nutrients you need to have. And one of them are certain fatty acids, those we know as omega-3 fatty acids. And they're most rich in seafood, in fish, and shellfish. And in fact, it's interesting that the fish and the shellfish, they do not produce these fatty acids, which we need as human beings. It's important for our heart and coronary system. They're extremely important for our brains and neural system. You can't get them from plant, even if some health gurus say you can just eat linseeds. No, it's not the same omega-3 fatty acids. They come from the algae. That's where they're produced, and then they pile up through the food web. For instance, in fish, where they're very rich in fish tissues and fish oil. But the prime source, that's the algae. So when one talks about sustainability and food, it's very important to be aware of the fact that, I mean, the game on this planet is that organisms, they thrive on each other. We eat each other, but it all starts on the bottom, and something, little organisms on the bottom, and bigger organisms eat that, and bigger organisms eat that. And there's a very long way from little algae up to, say, a pig, roast pork. And every time you go through an organism, you lose 90% of the nutrients. That's why quite often it's said that it's much more sustainable to eat the feet of the pig than eating pork. So, and it's just basic science. So in order to eat more sustainable, we have to look at the bottom of the food webs, and that's where we find plants, and we find algae, including seaweeds. And then there's some animals a little higher up, and those are the animals that filter whatever on the bottom of the sea, and that's bivalves. For instance, like blue mussels. So blue mussels and seaweeds, that's the most sustainable marine crops at all. Those we should learn to eat. And as you know, there's nothing wrong with blue mussels. It tastes wonderful. Lots of umami. And many seaweeds also have umami. That's, by the way, something I worked on myself to figure out which seaweeds are the most rich in umami. And then they have plenty of proteins, minerals, various trace elements which are important for your body. They have iodine. They have these fatty acids which are so important. So we should eat from low bottom. So this is a long answer to your question. Yes, algae, in particular seaweed, they have to be counted in the green transition. And that's, sometimes I phrase this, that blue is green, in the sense that we have to look for the ocean for both nutrients, but also something that can enrich in a sustainable way the plants from the land. And this is, of course, where we nowadays also run into trouble, certainly in highly industrialized agricultural societies like Denmark, where I'm in, but also a lot of other European countries, also Asian countries. We do very intensive farming on land, and over time used all sorts of agents to increase the crop by fertilizers and insecticides. And then we have washouts of these excess nutrients and various chemicals into the ocean. It poisons our sea. So by having such intensive farming, in particular kind of farming where you not only grow crop, but you feed the crop to animals, and you lose most of it in that process. At the same time, you limit the possibilities in our seas. To me, I think that's the most severe problem we have to deal with. And right now it's a hot political agenda in my country, in Denmark, where we have very intensive farming, and the fish in our waters are almost gone.
Yeah. Is there anything else you would like to mention before we wrap up? Something we haven't spoken about that we should.
Maybe we should come back to the beginning, because all this talk we've been doing about food and sustainability and nutrition and future, we should not forget that food is something that's supposed to be enjoyed. And this is way back to the chef, that food and food culture, the fact that you dine together, that's a human trait. And the more remote people get from the basic course of shopping for food or growing food, preparing food, teaching your children how to cook, and the more we get away from spending time on actually dining together and spending our time on all sorts of other issues, the less the more remote we come from the starting point of us being human beings. Because human beings, we developed around this fireplace. I mean, almost 2 million years ago, humans learned how to use fire. So from that time, all humans became chefs, and we're the only organism on the planet, the only animal on the planet that heat prepare our food. That's interesting to think about. We learned how to use heat, which meant that we can prepare both meat and vegetables and seeds and all sorts of things in a way that gives us more nutrients, but also more flavorful food. And you know that as a chef, I mean, you have the raw ingredients, it may be nice and good and flavorful, but it's only once they've been prepared in one way or the other in the kitchen. So this, I think, is important to keep in mind all the time, that food is not only nutrients and sustainability and health, it's also a human trait, it's culture. And in many ways, this comes first, and the more you forget it, the worse trouble we may get. So maybe that could be final conclusion or final words.
Ole, thank you very much.
Oh, you're most welcome.
Tusen takk for at du hørte på Bendixen Airways. Dersom du har tips, kommentarer eller vil gi en vurdering av episoden, så gjør gjerne det. Det setter jeg stor pris på.